Holy Gospel. The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to St. Mark.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
From there Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there, yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And Jesus said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed and the demon gone. Jesus returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon toward the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment of speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers in his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then, looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, "Be open." And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak."
Santo Evangelio de nuestro Señor Jesucristo según San Marcos.
Gloria a ti.
Se dirigió Jesús a la región de Tiro. Entró en una casa sin querer que nadie lo supiera, pero no pudo esconderse. Pronto supo de él la madre de una muchacha que tenía un espíritu inmundo, la cual fue y se arrodilló a los pies de Jesús. La mujer no era judía, sino originaria de Sirofenicia. Fue pues y rogó a Jesús que expulsara de su hija al demonio. Pero Jesús le dijo, deja que los hijos coman primero, porque no está bien quitarles el pan a los hijos y dárselo a los perros. Ella respondió, pero Señor, hasta los perros comen debajo de la mesa las migajas que dejan caer los hijos. Jesús le dijo, por haber hablado así, vete tranquila, el demonio ya ha salido de tu hija. Cuando la mujer llegó a su casa, encontró a la niña en la cama. El demonio ya había salido de ella. Jesús volvió a salir de la región de Tiro y pasando por Sidón llegó al lago de Galilea, en pleno territorio de Decápolis. Allí le llevaron un sordo y tartamudo y le pidieron que pusiera su mano sobre él. Jesús lo llevó a un lado, aparte de la gente, le metió los dedos en los oídos y con saliva le tocó la lengua. Luego, mirando al cielo, suspiró y dijo, Ephphatha, es decir, ábrete. Al momento los oídos del sordo se abrieron y se le desató la lengua y pudo hablar bien. Jesús les mandó que no se lo dijeran a nadie, pero cuanto más se los mandaba, tanto más lo contaba. Llenos de admiración decían, todo lo hace bien, hasta puede hacer que los sordos oigan y que los mudos hablen. El Evangelio del Señor.
Te alabamos, Cristo Señor. It is Labor Day weekend, even if we're in Mexico. Canadians may participate. And that means that some of us are looking for some R&R. Maybe tomorrow there will be some R&R for some of you. There's a story of little Johnny who used some rough language in Sunday school, Labor Day weekend. His teacher was appalled. And through pursed lips, she said, Johnny, do you know what happens to little boys who talk as you have just spoken? And Johnny said, I sure do. They grow up to become golfers. Greg Kavanaugh is going to go golfing tomorrow, I'm just betting. And use language we don't need to hear, Greg. We could probably, all of us, use a little downtime, a little recreation given what we've experienced in the past couple of weeks. An earthquake in Haiti, the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban, Hurricane Ida making landfall in Louisiana, wreaking havoc all the way up the East Coast, and then that little Delta variant we keep hearing about. We're all ready, perhaps, for a little R&R. You gotta wonder about that event in Afghanistan. 20 years we were there trying to change a culture. You might have thought that having watched the Soviet Union try to change Afghan culture in 10 years, we would have learned our lesson. They say those who do not listen to history are destined to repeat it. And here we are having repeated history. But all of us feel deeply and most profoundly, particularly for women and young girls under Taliban rule. Indeed, we might feel a trifle concerned for women and young girls throughout that region where there is nothing like gender equity. As a matter of fact, we have a long way to go in the Western Hemisphere toward establishing anything that looks like genuine gender equity. Judith Shulevitz wrote a very interesting article in this month's issue of the Atlantic magazine. It's the last article in the magazine, glad I did not skip it. And she writes about a 17th century priest named Francis Poullain, who argued vigorously in the 17th century for gender equality. He particularly valued the work of women raising children, which was considered a lesser occupation, a lesser commitment. And he talked about the formation of cultures and how important women are in the formation of cultures. One historian says this: Poullain is the first thinker in modern Europe to build his entire social philosophy on a universal concept of equality. And Poullain's vision of equality began with women. Jesus was fully human as well as fully God, we recognize in our creed, and as such was formed by his own culture and the prejudices within that culture. And yet Jesus evolved in his understanding to have a very inclusive ministry, a ministry that was inclusive of women, and a ministry that impacted the early Christian church in remarkable ways, so that a shift and a change was affected by that early Christian community that permeated the cultures all around the Greco-Roman Empire. And I wonder if that change of heart, as Jesus moved out of his cultural perspective, his cultural prejudices, toward a new understanding of inclusiveness in relationship to all peoples, and particularly toward women, I wonder if that didn't perhaps begin today in the city of Tyre. Tyre is in contemporary Lebanon. It's on the sea. And we're told that Jesus did something that no good rabbi should have done. He left Israel and he went for a seaside vacation in Tyre. He wanted nobody to know that he was there at his seaside getaway, escaping the pressures of ministry, time with his disciples, perhaps refreshing in prayer. We don't know. But they wouldn't leave him alone. And a Syro-Phoenician woman, we're told, found her way into the house and, kneeling at Jesus' feet, asked for the healing of her daughter. And we just read Jesus' response. It's probably good background to know that though we love our dogs, who has a dog here? We love our dogs. What are we going to do this year about blessing of the animals? Are we going to have blessing of the animals in October? I suppose if it doesn't rain, we can still have blessing of the animals. We love our dogs, but in Jesus' day, dogs were scavengers and they were not viewed kindly. In fact, that's still true in the Middle East. When I lived in Turkey, outside of the big cities, dogs were more likely to be kicked than to be coddled. And so when Jesus says to the woman who asked for the healing of her daughter, it is not right for the children's food to be given to the dogs, he has said something deeply insulting to that woman. But that woman is quick-witted. She is persistent. She is sharp. What we miss in the English is that she responds with the diminutive. And she says, but even the puppies under the table get the scraps. Even the puppies. And Jesus determines to give her what she asks. We wonder if Jesus didn't, in that moment, experience God moving in his heart in a new way to change the course and direction of his ministry, because thereafter he does something very strange for a Jewish rabbi, and he continues to hang out in Gentile territory. In fact, the Gospel of Mark tells us that he went to the Decapolis. He went to the Decapolis by way of Tyre and Sidon. Sidon is north of Tyre. And then he went to the Sea of Galilee over to where Amman, Jordan is today. So that's rather like saying Jesus went to San Miguel by way of Mexico City and Tijuana. He spent a long time in the Decapolis. In 1796, there was a presidential election in the United States. John Adams was running for president. And John Adams thought that campaigning was an unseemly thing to do. Oh, for the good old days. And so John Adams decided he would give one campaign speech. Oh, for the good old days. And he gave his one campaign speech in his Unitarian house of worship outside of Boston. And a lot of people were interested, and so they crammed in. Not everybody would fit. A lot of people were trying to hear outside, and it is reported that an usher said, "Speak up. Remember the people on the outside." The Syro-Phoenician woman spoke up, not only for herself, not only for her daughter, but for all the people on the outside. And the Lord worked in the Messiah's heart, and he began to expand his ministry to those who were not Israelites, who were not Hebrews. And he dedicated an enormous amount of time to ministry in the area we call the Decapolis. He expands beyond his own people, his own cultural prejudices, and the parameters which his culture had imposed on him. And that is exemplified by his healing of the Gentile man who had an impediment of speech and could not hear. We all know how alienating it can be when we find ourselves somehow apart in this world. To not be able to hear is to not be able to enter into fully conversation. As all of us here who wear hearing aids can testify. To not be able to speak is to not be able to express oneself or one's opinions and to engage in human converse. And so Jesus takes this Gentile and treats him as Jesus treats every one of us in the midst of our own personal challenging circumstances and limitations. He takes the man apart. He shows him respect. He speaks his language, it is sign language, but he makes sure that he speaks a tongue the man can understand. And so he puts his fingers in the man's ears, indicating what he is about to do. And he spits and touches his tongue, knowing the Gentiles believed that the power and essence of a person was in their spittle. And he looks up to heaven, indicating from where healing always is to come. And then he says, and Mother Karen pronounces this word better than I do, epaphatha. Is that right, Mother Karen? Epaphatha. Be open. And the man is able to speak and able to hear. And the prophecy which we heard today in Isaiah is fulfilled in his healing of a Gentile. It is a message, a sign of how Jesus will deal with every one of us. What is Jesus doing in the Decapolis? He is reaching out to the outsiders. He has changed his ministry and the course of his ministry, perhaps because that Syro-Phoenician woman raised her voice and advocated for herself, and thereby advocated for many, an outsider. This deeply impacted the early church. And so the early church became a remarkably inclusive community. And sometimes we read the epistles and they sound to us sexist and misogynist, but in the first century they were revolutionary in the fact that women had leadership roles and were treated equally in many instances and cases. And we can see this in today's reading from the book of James, one of my favorite epistles, not an epistle written by St. Paul. We don't know who the author of the book of James was. But in the book of James, James says over and over again, you shall show no partiality. And what's interesting about that word partiality is that it rarely appears in the Greek language. It rarely appears anywhere outside of the New Testament. If you show partiality, you commit sin. You dishonor another. You are convicted if you show class partiality. This is a new message in the Greco-Roman world. It's one we probably still need. Many social movements were rooted in the Christian scriptures. There are implications in the Christian scriptures for marginalized people, for women in the Western Hemisphere, as well as for women in Afghanistan and in the Middle East. Maybe we have gotten as far as we have because of the perseverance and the sass and the wit of that Syro-Phoenician woman, whom God may have used to change the Messiah's heart and the course of his ministry. Therefore, speak up. In the words of Adam's usher, remember people on the outside. Amen.
Amen.